Don't believe at face value all kinds of nonsense without investigation, that something can come into being of itself from dust, and that people used to be apes.
Darwinists would be like, no, if you have enough time. And it's like, no, you haven't done the math. You guys didn't give enough time. 14 billion years, it's not enough time. Do you know what are the odds of even 150 amino acids lining up perfectly to make a protein and that's not even have it do something. You still need to inject information to tell it what to do. We don't even know we know where that comes from.
Right.
There's so many problems, and they're shutting down the people that are revealing these problems.
Right.
And to me, it's just exciting because it's just like, it's not like this prideful, like I'm right. It's just fun. I love watching establishments kind of crumble, but not in like a chaotic way. More like, no, you try to conceal this stuff, and the white lab coat, we might as well go into a Catholic church and confess to a white lab coat, and be like, sorry, I doubted you, and I love that that's going away, because the truth is coming out, which is like more mystery, about everything we think we know, and that's so cool.
Is because of the individual and his ability to reason and challenge the existing established dogmas. That's the mythology that they always tell, when it comes to the history of science. And now the irony is that science is quite literally about going along with every single piece of the confession, the 10 commandments of scientism. And if you diverge at any point, you're essentially a kind of a heretic, and you're absolutely right to connect it to the way the mass media works. All of it works in that same way, or you're not going along with what we know is the consensus, when that has it's not even been established.
English philosopher Darwin created an entire system according to which life is a struggle for existence, a struggle of the strong against the weak, where those that are conquered are doomed to destruction and the conquerors are triumphant. This is already the beginning of a bestial philosophy, and those who come to believe in it wouldn't think twice about killing a man, assaulting a woman, or robbing their closest friend. And they would do all of this calmly, with a full recognition of their right to commit these crimes.
It's a worldview that I think the establishment has intentionally promoted for a long time, precisely because of its social engineering power. Now, I'm not saying that everything that scientists propose in terms of biology is false or anything that absurd, but I do think there is a concerted agenda on the part of particularly the Royal Society out of England to really have to really demand that the academic world accept this worldview, and it really is a worldview. It's not just a theory. In an ironic twist, it actually becomes a massive narrative and worldview for man's origins, and as well as where man is going. And I think they pushed that on purpose. And so the mere questioning of it and dissent has for many years led to people being fired, being blacklisted in academia. You don't get published. It's the stuff that I've witnessed from academics, philosophers of science.
Saint Nectarius, a much venerated miracle worker, theologian, philosopher, and educator of modern Greece, wrote many books and pamphlets for the spiritual edification of the faithful. In his study concerning the immortality of the soul and the holy memorial services, he wrote of the moral implications of evolutionary theory. Those who deny the immortality of the soul undermine both the moral law and the foundations of societies, which they want to see collapsing into ruins, in order that they might prove that man is an ape from which they boast that they are descended. Nectarius read Lamarck's evolutionary treatise Philosophie Zoologique and Darwin's The Descent of Man. Discussing these works in his book Sketch Concerning Man, St. Nectarius contrasted the evolutionary view that man is only quantitatively different from the beasts with the Orthodox Christian review that he is qualitatively different. The saint wrote, "The 2 volumes of the work Philosophie Zoologique are in their entirety intended to uphold the degrading evolutionary theory regarding man. The first volume seeks to prove that the human organism evolved from that of an ape as a result of chance circumstances, and the second volume seeks to prove that the distinctive excellences of the human mind are nothing but an extension of a power which the animals have, differing only in degree. Having weak and badly set foundations, Lamarck claims to prove that in earlier times the nature produced through marvelous evolution one species from another earlier one. He seeks to establish a gradual chain having successive, not contemporaneous, links, and thus to produce finally the human species through a metamorphosis that is the reverse of the truth, and not less marvelous than the transformations one reads about in myth. The Darwinian theories imagined that they arrived at the solution of the anthropological question by accepting the mode of evolution. These theories, not being based on sound foundations, instead of solving the problem, render it more enigmatic because they denied the validity of revealed truth, viewed man as belonging to the same order as the irrational animals, denied his spiritual origin, and attributed to him a very lowly origin. Their failure had as its chief reason the negation of his lofty origin and of his spiritual nature, which is altogether alien to matter and to the physical world. In general, without the acceptance of revealed truth, man will remain an insoluble problem. The acceptance of it is the firm and safe foundation upon which every inquirer about man must base himself. It is from that he must begin in order to rightly solve the various parts of the question and learn the truth by means of true science.
Okay, in general, academia, evolution is defined as changes in heritable traits in populations. Key point there, populations, and it's commonly broken down into categories. You hear a lot, micro, macro. One assumes the other. Evolution is said to occur through adaptation, as JF mentioned, changes in allele frequency, natural selection, random mutation, and sexual selection. Now, that's more academic. For the general populace that accepts wholesale the concept of evolution, they're accepting very much a story, which I also think JF did a good job telling the story in his opener. The image of evolution is reduced to like bumper stickers, Darwinian fish with legs, the chimp becoming a human in 4 frames or less. The story of evolution is more adopted than the actual mechanics. So when we are talking here, me and Posh, with you guys, we want to point to the mechanisms, right? Not the story. And so I don't even believe it's an accident that people accept the storyline of it because it's easier. It needs to be sold in low resolution, and this is what I mean by low resolution. If someone draws a circle on the chalkboard and let's call that circle evolution, and the person, in this case JF and Richard, tell us to look at that circle, but they say no, stand 33 feet away, and then we look at the circle, we go, oh, we can make out a circle. It's very clear, clean, sharp. It's a circle. But when we come closer, right, when we stand a foot away, we realize that circle is not connected in any way. It's made of dots. It's made of different dashes that aren't even really in line with a perfect circle. And we realize that our eye and our mind interpolated and connected the dots of that circle. And I believe that evolution, largely how it's told in a story form, is very much the same way you would connect the dots of a circle and complete it in your mind. But once you get into the nitty gritty of it, you realize something's missing. What's missing? The actual mechanism, the actual mechanics. What is actually happening, not what is thought to have happened. What do we assume to happen? What has actually happened?
The whole purpose and intent of the theory of physical evolution is to find an explanation of the world without God, i.e., physical evolution is, by its nature, atheistic. And it's only ridiculous when theologians run after the latest scientific theory in order not to be left behind by the times. Further, the God of theistic or spiritual evolution is not the God of Orthodox Christianity. The sophisticated, worldly wise laugh at those who call evolution a heresy. True, evolution is not strictly speaking a heresy, neither is Hinduism strictly speaking a heresy. But, like Hinduism, evolution is an ideology that is profoundly foreign to the teaching of Orthodox Christianity, and it involves one in so many wrong doctrines and attitudes that it would be far better if it were simply a heresy and could thus be easily identified and combated. Evolutionism is closely bound up with the whole apostate mentality of the rotten Christianity of the West. It is a vehicle of the whole new spirituality and new Christianity in which the devil is now striving to submerge the last true Christians. It offers an alternative explanation of creation to that of the Holy Fathers. It allows an Orthodox Christian under its influence to read the Holy Scriptures and not understand them, automatically adjusting the text to fit his preconceived philosophy of nature. Its acceptance cannot but involve the acceptance also of alternative explanations of other parts of divine revelation, of an automatic adjustment of other scriptural and patristic texts to fit in with modern wisdom. Our only wisdom comes from the Holy Fathers, and all that contradicts it is a lie, even if it calls itself science.
There was, in the history of the West, especially a kind of a vacuum left with the challenge to the church by Voltaire, Diderot, the sort of the philosophes, who were reacting to legitimate corruption in the Roman Catholic institution. And so what this did was it kind of turned people away towards the idea that, well, maybe natural science and just the progress of the humanities could somehow, provide answers to everybody's questions. And so there's just this de facto kind of transference over to what Foucault called the rise of the priest class, right? So the priest class, or excuse me, the science class became the priest class, is what I'm trying to say. Foucault has an essay on shepherding and how the idea of the medieval shepherd as the bishop of the church was sort of transferred over into the guy in the lab coat. So you just had a switching, if you will, of priestly vestments to lab coat vestments is what this would eventually bring about. And so once the idea of God had been removed from the sciences after the Enlightenment with the empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, D'Holbach, those kind of characters, common sense philosophy. After that, you have the rise of, the removal of the idea of God within nature itself. And so that's where, instead of blind process and deism, or from Descartes or people like that, we don't even need the watchmaker at all, right? The watchmaker gets tossed out. And so the immanent processes of nature themselves become kind of the answer, the end-all, be-all.
What ought we to preach? We should cry to all, sons of the kingdom of heaven, don't run from the kingdom and into bondage and slavery, for they are in fact running. Some are captivated by freedom of mind. They say, we don't want the bonds of faith and the oppression of authority, even divine authority. We'll figure things out and make up our minds for ourselves. So they have made up their minds. They have built fables in which there is more childishness than in the mythology of the Greeks, and they magnify themselves. Others are enticed by the broad path of the passions. They say, we don't want to know the positive commandments or the demands of conscience. This is all abstract. We need tangible naturalness, and they have gone after it. What has come of it? They have bowed down before dumb beasts. Has not the theory that man originated from animals arisen from this moral fall? This is where they have gone, and everyone runs from the Lord. Everyone runs. The truth of God is simple. Can a proud mind study it? Such a mind would rather think up its own thing, sensational things, although empty and weak as a spider's web. To see that this is so, look at the current theories of the creation of the world. They are like a somnambulistic or drunken delirium. And yet, how good they seem to those who invented them. How much energy and time are wasted on this, all in vain. The deed was accomplished simply. Quote, he spake and they came to be. He commanded and they were created. End quote. Psalm 148, verse 5. No one can think up anything better than this solution. The Sadducees had a seemingly insoluble objection to the resurrection, but the Lord solved it with a few words to them, and so clearly that everyone understood and acknowledged the Sadducees to have been beaten by the truth of his word. What the Sadducees were then, unbelievers of all sorts are now. They have heaped up a multitude of fanciful suppositions for themselves, elevated them to the status of irrefutable truths, and plumed themselves on them, assuming that nothing can be said against them. In fact, they are so ungrounded that it is not even worthwhile speaking against them. All of their sophistry is a house of cards. Blow on it and it flies apart. There is no need to refute it in its parts. It is enough to regard it as one regards dreams. When speaking against dreams, people do not prove the absurdity in their composition or in their individual parts, but only say, it's a dream. And with that, they resolve everything. It is the same with the theory of the formation of the world from a nebula and its supports, with the theory of abiogenesis and Darwin's origin of genera and species, and with his last dream about the descent of man. It is all like delirium. When you read them, you are walking in the midst of shadows. And scientists, well, what can you do with them? Their motto is, if you don't like it, don't listen, but don't prevent me from lying.
We can get from a fox to a polar fox and a desert fox. One has smaller ears to better deal with keeping as much heat in, the other having very large ears for expelling as much heat out. But this does not actually, as we will attempt to show, account for massive changes in organisms, like the circulatory system, like going from a 3-chambered heart to a 4-chambered heart. Nothing in between those two is beneficial. In fact, it is massively, massively problematic and detrimental for the survivability of these intermediary species. I would also like to add the fact that evolution, as much as we might like to deal with its inner mechanics, cannot explain even the arrival of life on Earth, by which I mean the formation of the protocell. And as much as biochemistry is, and even, of course, synthetic chemistry is developing, we're getting actually further from the goal of being able to produce prebiotically relevant amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates, etc., that are necessary for the formation of the protocell. But even if we get these from a biological system, that is to say, we can't start with them, no one knows how to hook them up. We get a lot of stories again, oh, it might have happened in this lake, it might have happened over here. But not only do we get just fantasies, we also get breaking laws of thermodynamics with massive increases in energy, with massive decreases in entropy. So I think we will go for the fact that mechanisms do have to account for everything, because there is no intelligent entity.
There's a branch where we look into what's called origins science, and right, so where we're looking into man's origins, and when we look there, we realize that there's a little. It's not the same thing as looking under a microscope or looking at somebody's body and cells and so forth. Origins science, although it's related to the body, involves a lot of speculation, a lot of hypotheses, because we don't know what happened aeons in the past. So we have to theorize, and we have to utilize a lot of speculation. Now, I'm not saying it's all wrong, or I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. But what I'm saying is that most people don't realize that what underlies the traditional Big Bang / Darwinian narrative is gigantic aeons of time that are built upon huge amounts of speculation.
A man who does not believe in God wants to explain, from the gyrations of the cosmic dust, the origin of the world, whereas in every blade of grass, in the structure and life of even the tiniest beings, there is enclosed so much information that it is beyond human understanding. The many centuries of human wisdom have not been able to create one living grain. And meanwhile, unbelief tries to explain all the wondrous variety in the world by unconscious movements of matter.
Now, people in the normie science realm will often say things like, well, peer-reviewed science tells us X, Y, Z, as if this was just some monolithic entity, right? That again, the peer review just falls down from the Pope of science, upon Mount Olympus somewhere, as if there's just this consensus. And that's actually not even true. You can look at The Lancet, the famous magazine, medical journal from Oxford. They published an article a couple of years ago talking famously about mass fraud in peer-reviewed science. This even made its way to The Economist. The Rothschilds' Economist magazine a few months ago put out a piece saying that Some 400,000, they estimate, science journals do not even do the peer review that they claim to do. So this has been flooding now even into mainstream science. They're starting to figure out there's a crisis of peer review, so that itself can also be doubted. Just because somebody claims something's peer review is really meaningless. And I always come back to a few months ago, I was scrolling through Facebook, and within one scrolling feed, I saw two, quote, peer-reviewed science outlets claiming contradictory things. One says peer-reviewed science now confirms black holes are real. Scroll down a little bit. Peer-reviewed science now confirms there are no black holes, and we were lied to the whole time.
There is not a single science which could be established solidly on its own principles. Something can be obtained from all sciences, but this is not something that gives one the right to cite sciences as a decisive authority. It is not science itself that is the problem, but scientists who twist science however they want. Consequently, there are only the conjectures and inferences of scientists. These days, many nihilists of both sexes, naturalists, Darwinists, spiritists, and westernizers in general have multiplied among us. All right, you're thinking, would the church have been silent? Would it not have proffered its voice? Would it not have condemned or anathematized them if there had been something new in their teaching? To be sure, a council would have done so without a doubt, and all of them, with their teachings, would have been given over to anathema. To the current rite of orthodoxy, only the following item would have been added. To Buchner, Feuerbach, Darwin, Renan, Kardec, and all of their followers, anathema. But there is no need either for a special council or for any kind of addition. All of their false teachings were anathematized long ago. At present time, not only in principal cities, but in all places and churches, the rite of orthodoxy ought to be brought in and celebrated, so that all the teachings contrary to the word of God might be collected, and that it might be proclaimed to everyone what they must fear, and from what teachings they must flee, and all might know. Many are seduced intellectually only through ignorance, and therefore a public condemnation of pernicious teachings would save them all from destruction. If the action of an anathema is terrible to someone, then let him avoid the teachings that lead to it. Let him who is afraid of it, for the sake of others, bring them back to a healthy teaching. If you, who are not favorably disposed to this action, are orthodox, then you are going against yourself. And if you have already lost sound teaching, then what business do you have concerning what is done in the church that supports it? After all, you've already separated yourself from the church and have your own convictions, your own way of looking at things. Well, live with them then. It's all the same whether or not your name and your teaching are uttered under the anathema. You are already under anathema if you philosophize against the church and persist in this philosophizing.
I mentioned in my opening, for example, the alleged, at least evolution, of the circulatory system, and how the ventricle of a three-chambered heart was split by the interventricular septum into two ventricles, the left and the right one. How would you go about, step by step, by random chance, getting these hundreds, if not thousands of generations of cardiac patients? How would they have survived when we know that even if one of the chambers, for example, just has suboptimal function, it would make it almost impossible for a person to just go up a flight of stairs normally. They would have to be very careful with it. It is a condition that exists. So you would have a mechanical problem of massive proportions with massive consequences that massively reduce the survivability of the species, and you would need this to be an unguided process. So that would mean that natural selection would have to just not wipe them out, or it would mean that you can have that all this beneficial fitness doesn't really apply. As you said, you can have bad times, but these are not bad times. This is a dysfunctional mechanism, an essential one. The circulatory system is not functioning as it should.
So this is what Posh is talking about here, and I wanted to illustrate it on a heart. That's a human heart, I believe. You have two chambers here where the inputs of the blood come into the heart. And then you have two chambers here, the ventricle, where the blood is expelled outside. the right ventricle, the left ventricle will expel blood in your entire body, and this ventricle here will expel blood toward your lungs. And so Posh is asking, how can you evolve this septum? How can you evolve a split between these two chambers? Well, I would say in light of the function of the heart in species that breathe air, it is clear that there was a link between the fact that we had lungs and the fact that these lungs needed to be circulated with blood, and the fact that the blood that was then oxygenated needed to be passed to the rest of the body. So how do you evolve a septum? Well, probably in relation to the development of the lungs in the amphibians going into reptiles and mammals. I'm not an expert of art evolution at all, but it seems like it's not a massive evolutionary step to grow a wall between a chamber that was once a full chamber to split it in two. We've had this many times in evolution.
Hold on, but you told me you developed it because you needed it. Needing things does not mean you get things. And what I said is you needed to develop, as you described, both of you, you need it through random mutation and natural selection. So if you get partway there, or are you going for punctuated equilibrium, which can be a massive just appeal to faith? Are you saying you got an individual that already had the entire thing developed with all the ability to have the blood flow between the left and the right ventricle? Or are you saying that it happened somehow we will discover in the future? Again, needing it is a problem, not the solution.
Okay, well, let me rephrase the needed then, because I talk in language that is broad for people to understand. But here's what happens. The animals that are sending blood that is half oxygenated in their body and half oxygenated to their lungs eventually get outcompeted by those animals that are capable of sending the non-oxygenated blood to their lungs and the oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So think about the efficiency here. If you can just
right, but you don't get to the efficiency. You need time to get there. You're giving me the finished product. I'm saying
that's the finished product. I'm saying
right,
that along the way, any
gain
of small levels of efficiency, even if an animal was able to bias by one person, sending a little more unoxygenated blood to the lungs, a little more oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, it would beat the animals who don't split at all. So any kind of split between the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is an advantage. So
but if
that's
you don't
how
have
you get from a...
But you would need a fully developed ventricle. A half-developed ventricle just causes problems with the way the blood works. With a single ventricle also works. You don't need the septum.
If a single ventricle was there before, the heart, as it contracts, by the way, it expels the blood from the two ventricles at the same time. So it's not a big step to take a heart that is V-shaped and pump all the blood out versus pump all the blood out also, but have a chamber splitting the two. I mean, you guys are coming with problems that aren't problems. It's really not hard.
It is a problem.
Well, it's not a problem if you just say it isn't.
I don't know why you're focused on this rather arcane thing than
because
it's developing ability to breathe air.
Guys, one second.
Well, the whole point is it is crucial. These examples are exactly what I was pointing to in my opening. We're talking about actual mechanisms. So when Posh goes, well, let's just say this happened, why would it be advantageous for this to happen? And JF's response was, well, it could happen because if it needed to. But we're not talking about whether something needs to happen to justify that it does or can. It's that how does your mechanism make this happen actually? Not like, well, maybe there's a lung that helps and then maybe there's air. It's like these concepts we're actually looking for. Well, how do you actually make sense of this absent this appeal to nebulous time in the past where eventually something works itself out because it just needs to. We didn't,
It just needs to is shorthand. I mean, we'll say this for the rest of the debate. It just needs to is shorthand for you are going to have more offspring in your ecological niche.
Why would I have offspring of a broken heart? Why would I need to have offspring of a broken heart?
You're more likely to survive and have sex. That's why you have it.
Wait,
how would decreasing the volume of your heart be advantageous if you just get half the ventricle? I know it can.
Because sometimes doing something more efficiently, not wasting oxygenated blood sent to the lungs, is actually more efficient than a volume consideration. See,
but
you
if you
approach
don't get the
life
full
from an engineer's
ventricle,
perspective.
But if you get the full ventricle, you get the advantage of having it more separated out.
The process isn't an advantage.
If you have half the not half the ventricle, I mean half the septum, interventricular septum. If you just get half of it, you don't get any benefit of the splitting, and you get the disadvantage
because you
of
send
having
the
reduced
right
volume.
you send the right blood at the right place. And
it sounds like there's no such thing as disadvantage. Right. Is that better?
No,
there's no such thing.
99% of mutations are absolutely disadvantageous.
But it sounds like
to your immediate death.
Except for a broken heart, an unworkable heart, that doesn't lead to death.
It's not an unworkable heart. Obviously, if you have a broken heart, you're not going to survive and reproduce.
You're talking about multiple chambered hearts. You're talking about the evolutionary process from a 2-chambered to a 4-chambered. And what they couldn't understand, they pointed like a turtle with like a 3.5 or something chambered heart. But the point was, from a 2 chambers to go to 3 chambers, there has to be an evolutionary process of tissues moving, changing, and that in between those states of the finished product, it would not be evolutionary beneficial, which then would go against natural selection, that every generation of life is becoming fitter and fitter. This would insinuate it's becoming unfit, more fit, and now it has a 3-chamber heart. Well, that defies the logic of that worldview, and they could not process that.
No, and they also just assumed that if you can point to some, like in this case, the turtle, the state of affairs of its heart, suddenly it assumes that it's halfway to something, right? They just they fundamentally didn't understand that they're still just begging the question of like, well, it's halfway there, right? And we're like, halfway where? It could be halfway away from where you want to go. You don't even know, because you don't even know where you are in this process.
Darwinism, which declares that man, by means of evolution, has developed from the lower species of animals and is not a product of the creative act of the Godhead, has turned out to be merely a supposition, a hypothesis, which has become obsolete even for science. This hypothesis has been acknowledged as contradictory not only to the Bible, but to nature itself, which jealously strives to preserve the purity of each species and knows of no transition even from a sparrow to a swallow. There are no known facts of a transition of an ape into a man.
Say the first, an insect or a bird, the first one that's attempting to fly can't fly and got eaten.
Mm-hmm.
So he failed, right? So those genes don't move on, but the claim is, no, it was beneficial, and somehow it went on to the next generation, and then 7 generations. Then he flapped and he stayed up for 30 seconds. It's like, what?
Darwinism is collapsing precisely because of internal contradictions, stuff that actually, ironically, philosophers have pointed out for a long time, and proponents of creation have pointed out for a long time. And people are starting to recognize this. Critiques like the fact that within the human body, it's basically a bunch of little systems kind of stacked on bigger systems. So you have one big whole biosystem running that's a bunch of little systems, right? So, the eye, for example, can't function without blood, without tissue, which are themselves sort of systems. And so you can't have these mutations being random that also require all of those other systems to function and work well.
Right. When you start the code, it would pervert all of the code. And
correct.
It would render it non-functional.
Imagine, it's like let's just throw random codes into my computer and see if it works.
It's not salt on pasta. It's like it changes the entire function of everything.
Quote, in the late 19th century, however, a number of theologians enamored of the triumphant procession of godless science and evolutionism decided to change the church's teaching to bring it into line with the facts of scientific mythology. They began to teach that a day of creation lasted millions of years, that death existed even before the fall into sin, that man was not created from dust but descended from monkeys, and that evolution is a method of divine creation. All these conceptions contradict the patristic rules for interpreting Scripture and distort the very fundamentals of orthodoxy. For if death did not come into the world through man, Christ died in vain. He misdiagnosed us, and therefore he did not save us. If God could not create the world as he said in the book of Genesis, he is not true, not almighty, and not good. Not without reason did the saints of the last 2 centuries reject all attempts to combine evolution and Christianity. They called evolution, quote, mindless nonsense, St. John of Kronstadt, quote, bestial philosophy, St. Barsanuphius of Optina, and, quote, a destructive, poisonous teaching, Hieromartyr Vladimir of Kiev. They said likewise that a Christian ought not, quote, to weave in secret their various beliefs in which they think to combine both spiritism and geological nonsense with divine revelation. Proponents of the theory that man evolved from apes are ignorant of man and his sublime destiny because they deny that man has a soul and refuse that he is capable of experiencing divine revelation. They rejected the Spirit, and the Spirit deserted them. They abandoned God, and God abandoned them. Quote, professing themselves wise, they became fools, end quote. Romans chapter 1, verse 22. Quote, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not fit. Romans chapter 1, verse 28. A certain poet says very appropriately, when the malicious demons want to harm someone, first they strip a person's mind of sound reasoning and then persuade him to espouse a corrupt belief, so that man can no longer comprehend that he sins. This is true because if people were aware of what they were saying, they would not debase themselves or pride themselves on being descendants of the genus of primitive animals. The prophet very fittingly said about them, quote, man, being in honor, did not understand. He is compared to the mindless animals and has become like unto them, end quote. Psalms chapter 48, verse 20. Man, this mysterious being, was created by God as the pinnacle of creation in order for him to acquire knowledge of his Creator. In accordance to this great destiny, man was formed analogously. He received the honor of being fashioned in an entirely extraordinary and unique manner and was brought to life through God's divine breath. While all of creation was brought into existence from nothing by a single phrase, let there be, that externalized God's volition, man alone had his body formed by the hands of the divine Creator. Only he received a living soul, created through God's inbreathing, and only he is made in the image and likeness of his Creator. What a marvelous creation indeed. What an honor for man. What a great destiny. Truly his destiny is great and his honor is sublime. However, more marvelous is the manner in which his body and soul were created. Because he became the image and likeness of God and was created in order to live eternally and dwell in the same place as the heavenly angels. How noble was man made. How much did sin debase and ignorance humble him. But his is not so. Man was endowed with nobility, and he will remain noble even if certain people degrade themselves, even if certain people have forgotten about their sublime descent. Yes, man is a supreme creation, and nothing can be compared to him. The prudent portion of the human race, all who are truly wise, confirm this truth. Behold what Frederick de Ronmant says concerning man in his wise and insightful essay entitled Primitive Mankind, Its Religion, History, and Civilization. Man is of noble descent. He was born in paradise and not within a wilderness. The sound of angelic hymns, not the roars of tigers and the cries of wolves, echoed in his homeland. God was vigilantly watching over him even before man came to know him. It is not at all true that man created the idea of God in order to invent a certain divinity to worship. Humanity departed not from atheism, but from the faith, not from deception, but from truth, not from ignorance, but from revelation. Unfortunately, they who pride themselves on their resemblance to the animals seek to recruit new followers. They seek young laborers to overturn humanity's moral and ethical principles. They are looking for new diggers to help undermine the foundation of society and deprave mankind. Behold, the unethical moral principles that constitute their civilized mission. Pleasure, they say, debauchery, and love are good, but also so is hatred. The truth is good as long as it provides us with some enjoyment. However, deception, hypocrisy, and deceit are also good if they can help us increase our assets. Faith is good as long as there is something to be gained from it. However, treachery is also good if it can secure for us greater profit. Marriage is good as long as it makes us happy. However, adultery is just as good when marriage no longer satisfies our desires. Life is good as long as it remains an enigma. However, suicide is also acceptable when this puzzle has been solved.
Turned out they're against transhumanism. Well, sorry about you, but again, your paradigm insinuates evolutionary progress and the extension of man as a species is tied to his tools, and therefore the species itself is evolving in the technology, and the technology itself is considered basically us, and the fusing with us is the next evolutionary process. So your paradigm supports transhumanism, bro.
Which he admitted that I just asked him flat out, if we're nature and everything we do is nature, everything, there's nothing we can't do. There's nothing that we do that can't be evolution. Everything, including believing in God. And so that came up too, where they have to admit that belief in God is not only an evolutionary expression, but it's also an advantage. It's the better one. It's the better expression, right? And so he admitted that technology is considered evolution.
Transhumanism is also the end of evolution, both in terms of the goal and in terms of the end of this phase in the natural selection, supposedly, of creatures. We now are coming to the end. We're coming to a new beginning, and this is apparent from everything that they're attempting to do, take it in their own hands. The transhumanist disdain of humanity, the corollary of its rejection of God, is nothing new, but indeed it has its roots deep within the European humanism and the Enlightenment project.
Christ was born of a human being, the Panagia. Are we supposed to believe that his ancestors were monkeys? What blasphemy! And those who support this theory don't realize that they are blaspheming. They throw a stone and do not check to see how many heads they have cracked. All you will hear from them is, "Mine went farther than the other fellows." That's what they are all about these days. They marvel at who will throw a stone the farthest, but they care nothing about those who are passing by and the many heads that their stones will crack.
There's no such thing really as brute facts. If we're looking at an earthworm, if we're looking at something that we're studying and dissecting, in the realm of science, we might think that there's a brute fact, but in fact, we actually come with a lot of preconceived notions about whatever fact we're studying in the lab. And I think that what philosophy can do is help to enlighten that aspect of science. And most scientists don't study philosophy, so they don't think in that way. And so what you're seeing a lot of scientists do is come up against objections that people who might have a little bit of philosophical bent have been raising for a long time. For example, information theory, right? Information theory deals with, computers, engineering, this kind of stuff, big data even. And people who do information theory and information science have noted for a long time that when you look at the way the world living beings function with DNA, RNA, they seem to encode information. And we don't have any examples of anything in the world that transfers information, meaningful code, meaningful information that doesn't come from some mind, right? From some conscious creator or some conscious mind. And at least in the human realm, we can at least know that for sure, right? We can say that if a computer transfers information to another computer, it's because a mind has designed it to do so. So in the same way, when we see DNA and these kinds of things, it's clear that information is being transferred, and we don't see information just popping out of nowhere.
Through the misuse of his freedom, man has so corrupted his nature that he is only left to cry out, quote, "Wretched man am I, poor me, I cannot save myself," end quote. We require a new creation. We need an infusion of a new energy of grace. This is precisely what all mankind should say in order to believe in the incarnate Son of God. Such a humble admission, such a lowly confession of one's frailness, of one's guilt before God's handiwork. Is this in the spirit of the modern man? On the contrary, the contemporary conscience is saturated with the idea of evolution, the idea of progress. For example, the very idea that nourishes human pride. Christianity demands a humble conscience. There was perfect Adam, my forefather, and I, mankind, have only been involved in sin and corruption. The Church calls us to humility when she calls Adam our ancestor. But evolution? Descent from a monkey? No matter how modestly someone may judge himself, still he cannot avoid thinking with some pride. At least I am not a monkey. At least some progress has been realized in me. This is how evolution, by calling a monkey our ancestor, feeds our pride. If a monkey is our benchmark, then one can pride oneself in progress. But if we compare ourselves to the sinless Adam, this external progress will lose its value. The external progress is at the same time a refinement of sin. If humanity is moving forward in its development, then we can rely on ourselves. We can create ourselves. But the Church says the opposite. Quote, "We could not become incorrupt and immortal if the incorruptible and immortal one had not first become what we are now." To believe in the incarnation means to confess that without God, all of mankind is nothing. The Church, through the ages, carries the ideal of deification. This is a very high ideal, and it demands much from man. It is unthinkable without the incarnation. It forces man to first of all be humbled. Humanity rejects this high ideal, and it no longer needs the incarnation of the Son of God. An infinitely lowered ideal of life allows mankind to speak about progress. It gives it the opportunity to feel proud about its achievements. Precisely these two thought patterns comprise the two worldviews, the ecclesiastical and the secular. The ecclesiastical, the descent of perfect Adam, the fall, the need for the incarnation, humility. The secular, the ascent from the monkey, progress, the needlessness and denial of the incarnation, and pride.
You don't lose the normal human biases and the normal human desires for preeminence and glory and all this just because you don a lab coat. You're still a human being, and humans are susceptible to the same problems. And so they don't want to be wrong. What human being wants to be wrong, especially about fundamental views of the world? So the point is, and then I think Kuhn, for the most part, establishes this, that it takes a long time for people to dispense with hallowed dogmas. And the great irony, of course, about Darwinian, neo-Darwinian theories are that they are hallowed as dogma. It's well known, as Galertner himself even admits in this piece. Anybody who has challenged this, again, loses their credibility. They lose academic funding. They can lose their job, tenure, etc. There was a documentary that Ben Stein put out 10 years ago where he was pointing this out. I'm not advocating everything that Ben Stein says. I'm just saying that, he put out this documentary about skepticism in terms of Darwinism. And it was universally, hailed as this just total anti-science garbage. And they'll use all these sort of slogan terms of being, quote, anti-science. You're a science denier. You're a climate denier, right? And maybe other events that's intended to be associated with denying, right? Which is not scientific, right? I mean, science is not determined on the basis of consensus, as you pointed out in your comment, right? It's not. It really, literally would not matter if 99.999% of the entire world accepted a view, because that has absolutely nothing to do with its truthfulness. Scientific consensus, that is a fallacy. That's an informal fallacy. Appeal to consensus is a fallacy, but no shocker here, many people in the realm of science are not even aware of basic logical fallacies because they don't study logic. They don't study philosophy.
For this reason, God has given them up to shameful pleasures, so that they find pleasure only in things of the earth and not in heaven, and only in what provokes laughter from the demons and tears from Christ's angels. They take pleasure in looking after their bodies, in plundering the property of others, in stealing from the small and weak, in multiplying their earthly treasures and extending their states and their rule, in the wicked usurpation of homelands of others, in merriment and dancing, in the rejection of every faith as superstition, in the denying of God, in a totally biological life, in shamelessly calling monkeys their ancestors, in the drowning of anthropology in zoology.
We start with the end product. So we got here, and we had to have got to this point by some mechanism or some manner, right? And we see, a wolf become a chihuahua, therefore, it's, and I also mentioned the foxes, right? You can get a desert fox, with larger ears. I can understand that.
Yeah,
those are very...
I can understand that.
Right.
Even with humans and living in different climates and melanin and all this different stuff.
Certain things help out. If people had in Northern Europe, if they had a lot of melanin, it would be completely disastrous for them.
Right, it'd be detrimental.
Right. And if people didn't have enough melanin in Africa, that would also pose a problem. It would cause issues with the skin, and again, vitamin D would be a problem, etc. So you can see things. They are practical, but they are rather small compared to evolving entire body parts. And I couldn't get past that initial phase where I had to say, okay, but you need to also develop warm-bloodedness. How would you develop warm-bloodedness? Right. You need entire mechanisms to deal with it, or with the far more intellectual debate I had with Brenda on JimBob's channel. I mentioned the milk glands, right? You need an entire system of hormones to make sure milk is produced only when needed. And it is a very delicate system because it is incredibly taxing on the body to produce it. So first of all, how do you get to it?
Right. What was the first time, why would it be an advantage at that time? Like was it a pimple? Was it like a milk pimple? And they were like, oh, we got to keep that going, And
why would the baby have the instinct to suckle on it? Mm-hmm. Right? How do you get to that? That's information. You need that coded in. Yeah. So you could have, the glands. Let's grant it, but it still needs to be used in a proper manner. And they can't account for it, but it doesn't matter because, again, wolf to chihuahua, therefore milk glands.
Theistic evolutionists, if God is added to the theory of evolution, it becomes acceptable for Orthodox Christians. We are only against evolution if it is atheistic. But this is surely a very naive answer to a rather complicated question. What of the philosophy of evolution itself? Is it compatible with Orthodox Christian theology and philosophy, even with God added to it? All of the great heretics of history also believed in God. Indeed, quote, the demons also believe and tremble, end quote. More rigorous thinking than this is required before an Orthodox Christian can know what to think of evolution. With our own eyes, we witnessed many instances of his gift of clairvoyance. Once, when Geronda was still at St. Basil's Skeet, he met a layman near the Skeet's main church. Geronda approached him and said, "You are making some serious mistake." "What mistake?" the layman asked. "I don't know," Geronda replied, "but you are definitely making some serious mistake." "Can't we figure out what it is?" "Right now in the daytime we can't figure it out, but if you like, come down to my place at night." "All right, Geronda, I'll come after midnight." After midnight, the layman went out and met with Geronda. They began discussing things, and it turned out that this layman, even though he had a degree in theology, had written an entire book supporting Darwin's theory of evolution. Geronda said to him, "When you present a theory or an opinion, why don't you draw from the writings of the Holy Fathers or Orthodox theologians rather than heretics who aren't even Christian? A theory or viewpoint becomes fortified when it is confirmed by the Bible or by the Holy Fathers of the Church. You will not be welcome here in my hut until you renounce that theory." The theologian acknowledged that he had an incorrect viewpoint with this theory, and he asked Geronda to tell him how he had recognized it. Geronda answered, "When I approached you yesterday, a stench was coming out of you, and this made me realize that you have made some grave error. When it came to matters of the faith, Geronda tolerated no deviations. An academy student and missionary said to me that by God's creation in days one must understand millions of years. You poor missionary, you represent the omnipotent creator as being very weak and attribute millions of years to him. That's how your reason speaks, but I believe that, as the Lord said, quote, and the evening and the morning were the first day, end quote. One must understand days and not millions of years, for the Lord said, quote, and it was so. With a word he divided the water from the land, and the water, with a noise, stood in its indicated places. There were seas, the rivers and streams began to flow, and across the whole earth there were warm waters and cold springs. The Lord said, quote, let there be forests, and there were forests across the whole earth in perfect form, one kind in the north and another kind in the south. And then they began to gradually grow. So also the birds were created by God's word. They immediately flew across the whole earth and were of various kinds, and all the rest of creation, as it is said in the Bible. The more I consider nature, the more I am amazed and come to know the omnipotence of the Creator. Can one believe in Christ and doubt in the fall of the first people? If the story of the fall was a legend, an imaginary beginning of the following events of the observable history of the world, there would be no necessity in redemption of humanity by the Son of God, and the unity of people and God would never be broken.